Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by, and I won't stuff up your name so you can introduce yourself there, Sina.
Hi everyone, my name's Sina Babazadeh, Orthopaedic Surgeon.
Tell us a little bit about what you do, particularly in the surgical realm, Sina.
So, Orthopaedic Surgeon, so deal mainly in hip, knee and wrist surgery.
It's a bit of a weird combination.
It is. So I think where it all starts, as orthopaedic surgeons, we do a lot of hip and knee throughout your training. So at the end of it, you're almost geared to do that.
Is it one of those things that pretty much nearly every orthopaedic surgeon could do hip and knee just because you get exposed to it so much?
Pretty much. Like your 5 years, it's 2/3 hip and knee.
Yeah. So if you don't know what you're doing, you've probably failed your orthopaedic...
Thank you. Exactly. Like a backhanded compliment. Right.
No, not for you. I'm saying in general, if an orthopaedic surgeon has gone through a training program, doesn't know how to do those, then they're probably not paying attention, are they?
Exactly. They're probably, yeah.
And then wrist, where did wrist come from?
It all started like hip and knee we did a lot of. So I think wrists, when going through the training, when I got exposed to the hand and wrist surgeons, it was like, it's kind of mesmerizing because you see these guys come in, they sit down, type their notes, they sit down and operate, they sit down, eat coffee. So these guys just don't move. So I go, how good is this as a specialty? Where you could just do the entire thing sitting down and go, that's for me. So it mostly comes out of laziness. I don't like moving a great deal. I'm not very fit, so it kind of fit with my personality. And it's a complex joint. It's an interesting joint.
Yeah.
Evolutionarily, it's probably the most important joint of the body. I got in almost fisticuffs with another surgeon.
Oh, what happened?
Well, this was up in our ASM, and I mentioned that as the wrist being the most important joint of the body, and they disagreed, saying, no, it's the knee. I go, but but if you think about the wrist and your evolution as humans, basically we started up as quadrupeds, and we had to stand up. To do that, we knuckle walked on the wrist. Then we started climbing trees and gathering fruit, etc. Again, that required rotation to swing from branch to branch, and that again comes into wrist anatomy. Then we go back down in a dart throwing motion to try and use tools and lift.
Yeah, just the general manipulation of the world without your hands is much more difficult. And
exactly.
I think, I don't know the exact research into this, but I would say that there would be quite significant evidence to suggest that without the manipulation of the hand, as you said, i.e. via the wrist, we probably wouldn't be where we are right now.
No.
Which is an interesting kind of idea because, as you said, it is a structure that if you remove, what would actually have happened to our evolution?
It'd still probably be fish.
What is it? Do you know the neuroscientist? Is it David Wolpert? I think he's at Harvard. He's an English neuroscientist, and he talks about his theory is the size of the brain is purely just about developing our ability to manipulate our physical environment. And you think about it, the way that we do that is this. Like, these are the most special, unique tools that we have that separate us from the rest of mammalian evolution. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely. Without your hands, what are we? As surgeons, you'd struggle to operate without your hands.
You probably would.
There'd be a lot more court cases.
Or a lot less because they'd be dead.
No one to make it. You get not as many 5-star Google reviews. Yeah.
I feel like
have hands.
Society in general would be pretty different if we didn't have hands.
Especially for like Ansel, people who make gloves, they'd almost go bankrupt overnight.
They make condoms as well, so they'll be fine.
Exactly. That's the other side of the evolutionary ladder. Lots of businesses would go under.
So where are you currently based with your surgery? You're in Melbourne, obviously.
I'm in Melbourne, so I do public at St Vincent's, which is just up the road here, and Box Hill, and privately Glenferrie Private and Epworth Eastern are the main two. And
did you train in Melbourne?
I did, yes. Melbourne, Tasmania. So
how did you find that, and was it temptation for you to travel? I know that a lot of orthopaedic surgeons particularly like to do at least 1 year, travelling around trying to get some experience from some different sort of influences.
Yeah, so fellowship, I think you're alluding to. So after training, I went to Barcelona, did my fellowship up there in Spain.
What was that like?
Really good. So I think living in a country that's very different to Australia, and the training system here was amazing, and the food was really good as well. And the
That's
weather,
always nice.
Oh, it was brilliant, and the weather was really nice, and just the Spanish lifestyle was quite enjoyable.
Do you think that influences the way that they approach problems? It's something, and I'll preface this. I've just come back from Europe. I've been there for a while, involved with some of the coaching that I do for running, and the nice thing was I got to actually spend a significant period of time in one place, which you start to then understand a little bit more about the culture of a place, and you start contrasting it obviously with where you are. We were lucky enough we got to travel around a lot because we were going to different competitions, and you see that contrast everywhere. It's like these people behave like this, and you can kind of start to see the associations of like, I understand why they see the world like this, because it's part of their underlying culture.
And all the racial stereotypes.
Well, they're all whether people like this or not, they're all there. Right, and they exist. There obviously are individuals who don't fit into those stereotypes, but those stereotypes, I think, exist for real reasons, and they're probably... I find one of the interesting things, and obviously, you mentioned to us that you're Persian. It's a very old culture. I've got very close friends, as I said to you, that are Persian, and they're very proud of a lot of those features of their heritage and their culture. Now, does that mean that obviously there are stereotypes there? Yeah, maybe, but interestingly, I think that...
I do drive an Uber on the weekends. That's what you're alluding to.
I actually hope that's true and not a joke.
Exactly. And my parents do sell rugs.
But what I mean more than anything is I actually just think it's interesting because a lot of those cultures, older cultures, actually protect that. They're very proud to actually say, no, we don't want these things to change. We want these things to be part of who we are. And I think I haven't spent any time in Spain, but Spain, I'm sure, is exactly like that in many ways. And I know there's big differences between Barcelona and Madrid and all of that kind of stuff. But do you think that influenced the way that they see healthcare, the way that they do surgery, and the way they actually try and acquire knowledge?
100%. So you're right. Every single society has their own nuances, and they've all kind of evolved in different ways, and they're good at different things. I think examples I can give is, for example, the French tend to be quite novel at what they do, and what they do is quite different because they, I think, don't like following the English literature as much, so they have their own inbuilt things.
They have a propensity to want to buck the trend when it comes to, as you said, following things that come from more English-speaking countries, or even actually anyone other than the French.
Exactly, and the British more reserved, they're kind of more conservative in the way they do things, and the Americans are all like down to the letter, evidence-based kind of to the next level. So I think you're right, every society and every race and every country has their own nuances.
What was it like in Spain? What was the influence that you saw there?
So Spain was relaxed, I'd like to say is the word. So everything was a lot more relaxed. Theatre didn't start till 9 o'clock. Things ended by 3. Everyone took lunch off, and everyone had lunch together. So it was a lot more relaxed. They still got things done, but it was in a more relaxed fashion. And they had protected time for lunch and dinner. They had just an easy way of going about things, and they all got along really well. So I found that to be different.
Do you think that has that now come into the way that you approach things, and has that caused any issues for you at times where you're like, I'll get to it?
So I'm well known to be a lifestyle surgeon, which is a synonym for lazy. So
they actually use that term, lifestyle surgeon.
Not to my face, but behind my back. But I do live a relaxed life, and I try to take that Spanish mentality to the way I do things here.
Do you think that has advantages?
It does. I've got a lot more free time than everyone else.
No, but I mean professionally, do you think it has advantages?
Well, you're less stressed. If you're more relaxed about things, you're definitely less stressed. And the less stressed, I'm sure you all know about that mindfulness curve. So there's a level of stress that you perform best, and if you go too much over the line, you perform worse. So I'm definitely on the more less stressed side of things.
I don't know why I went down this rabbit hole. I told Jack while I was away, I have this habit when I've got extra time, I start going down the rabbit hole of philosophy. And one of the philosophers that I started looking at more is a guy named Turan, who's a Romanian philosopher who basically believed that work was a complete waste of time.
Yeah.
And it actually took up any opportunity to actually do any thinking. He had some other interesting theories too. Like one of his books was the problem with being born.
Yeah.
Something like that. Is a real nihilist. But
I think I filled out his Centrelink certificate there.
but an interesting thing is, I think for only a very short period of his life did he actually have a job. The rest of the time he basically was jobless and eventually made his money through his writing. But I did notice that a little bit, that the more time you have, especially for curious people, you tend to start thinking about different problems and different things. And I think that that's something that we sometimes lack here in Australia as a reflection whilst I was away, that we're so busy and we want to be busy and we see being busy as such a badge of honour, that I actually think sometimes it hurts our innovation, because we're not thinking laterally, we're not thinking about other problems. We're just like, oh, I've just got to get X done. I've got to see X number of patients, or for you guys, like I've got to get all of these surgeries backed up and done, on my surgical day, rather than actually taking the time to start thinking about some of these problems when you've got freedom in your timetable.
Oh, yeah, 100% agree. I think you're right, and I think to try and avoid monotony is one of the principles of life, and I think the problem with all of us is it's the monotonous tasks that make you money, and it's money that you kind of feel is the goalpost, is the gauge of success. But I tell, I guess, the registrars and anyone who'd listen, which is not that many people, is that if you can change your KPI from dollars to minutes, then your life changes with it. So if you could change your thinking to move away from how much is this making me to how many minutes it's costing me, then suddenly everything
You start seeing
changes.
it very differently, yeah.
Yeah, so things change, and then you value time a lot more. You don't waste time, like I'm not saying you should waste your time, but you value the time you have, and you're no longer spending all those minutes trying to earn money. You spend those minutes trying to gauge knowledge, enjoy life.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of looking at it.
I was going to say, did you find you had to rehabilitate yourself after finishing your training? Because it's such a long, arduous process to become an orthopaedic surgeon. I imagine that creates a certain mindset that probably takes a little bit of time to break, because you're just consistently studying for, 15, 20 years?
I think that's almost an urban myth. A lot of people say what they do is hard. It wasn't that hard.
Okay.
To be fair, I've heard all the other surgeons who came on your podcast. Everyone goes, "Oh, it was like so hard and arduous." It was all right. It wasn't super hard. But you're right that you did. The problem wasn't the hardness. The problem was the hours. You had to spend a lot of hours again doing monotonous tasks.
Yep.
And the problem was that you had to do what someone else told you to do. You couldn't do your own thing. So at every point in your training, you're learning, and there's always someone supervising you, so you had to do what you were told, and even if you didn't agree, you still had to do it. So I think that's the hard bit of training, and if you have a strong mindset, then sometimes you're conflicted with that authority, and that's what made it mentally difficult to get through those years. And the long hours, like it was long hours, but but I think as soon as you come out of training, then all that is lifted off your shoulders. You no longer have to do what someone tells you you must do. You're your own person. And I think it's a sigh of relief. You've got control over your time now. You've got control over what you do. And I think that was the biggest change going from training to consultancy. Finally having the ability to do what you wanted as opposed to what other people wanted you to do.
Culturally, do you think Australia is very similar to, say, the UK in terms of being perhaps a bit more reserved with how we do things in general, but even within the medical health professional world?
I think so. I think, being a British colony, we're halfway between America and US in terms of, I guess, orthopedics. The Americans are very much work, operate. The British are very much, conservative, try non-operative methods, and we're halfway in between in pretty much all senses.
Yeah, because the reason why I asked is like thinking about John's question about your experiences in Spain and how that affected how they approach, say, medicine. thinking about some of the cultural traits we have here and how that affects how our healthcare system works or how health professionals engage with patients. What are your thoughts or experiences there?
So I think, yeah, is it a dog?
It's a dog, yeah, don't worry.
I can't even see the dog. Yeah, so what's the question again? Sorry.
Just thinking about how Australian culture influences how health professionals, medical
so I think
medical field works.
Yeah, so I think it's not so much the culture, but the system per se. Australia has a dichotomous approach of public versus private, and the two systems are very different, even though it's the same surgeons working in both. Public's more geared to free healthcare. Everyone benefits from it, but I guess it's a little bit more inefficient. The hours are set, the pay is low, and private tends to be the opposite. So only the people who have insurance benefit. The hours are longer, it's more intense. There's a lot more patient-driven focus in that regard. So it's not so much, I guess, the Australian culture, but the healthcare system within that culture that defines how we work. And again, that's the difference between America and US. America is 100% private system. It's all about the dollars. And hence the intensity and the focus is on long hours, intense, quick operations. While in Britain, it's the NHS, which is a lot more, I guess, a socialist system, and hence the focus is on, if we don't have to operate, we don't have to operate, because, it's all about more safety, conservative approach, etc. So it's more the system within the country as opposed to, I guess, the culture that defines.
Sure. You obviously do both. How do you feel in terms of how it changes your practice working in the two different spaces, private versus public?
So again, the almost two ends of the spectrum. Public, a lot more collegiate. You're within a group of surgeons.
Is that nice? Like having a little bit more collaboration going on? I
find it really nice. I think, as humans, we're social animals, so I find that side of things to be the best part of medicine, orthopedics, of anything, of life. So I enjoy that collegiality of having a unit, and a unit
working together,
discusses things together, and you enjoy a beer afterwards, etc. While in private, it's a lot more independent. You're a business. You have your own ABN. It's all about you, how busy you are, how many operations you do, and your bottom line. So,
how do you see, going a step further back, how do you see that system influences the outcomes that people get? Do you think that it gets better or worse outcomes? Or do you think it doesn't matter?
To be fair, I'll go back to Voltaire's, a physician's role is to keep the patient amused while nature takes its toll. So the end result tends to be similar, I must say. On one end, you're going from a conservative approach and you only operate if you must, and then you end up with the results. On the other end, you're operating on pretty much everyone, and you end up with a result with maybe a few more complications. So the end result generally tends to be similar. Public system, you wait longer, things are a little bit more chronic. Private, you probably overdo it, get in a bit too quickly. The perfect pathway would be somewhere in the middle, but like all truths. But I think the end result tends to be similar. You don't see a lot of public patients hobbling around with broken bones, and you don't see all the private patients, doing bench presses of 200 kilos at the age of 90. So it evens out. It all evens out eventually.
Well, it's nice to know, because I think that there would be people who maybe can't or don't have the funds to go down the private realm, sometimes thinking, the grass is greener if I get in early and I get to pick this specific surgeon. But I think one of the messages that we often get asked that, because obviously we're usually the person that sometimes they're like, well, all right, we're not getting anywhere, surgery an option? And you say, well, yeah, it is. Well, I don't have private health. It's like, okay, well, you're going to have to go through the public system. And they say, what's it going to be like? I said, well, honestly, most of the top surgeons are working in the public system anyway. So you might have to wait a hell of a lot longer, as you said, but you're probably getting a very high quality surgeon to start with.
Yeah, it's the same surgeons. One, you wait longer, but it's free. One, you pay for, you're getting quicker. But I honestly do think the end result, and it's the same equipment. Some people think you get better equipment
really?
in the private versus the public, but it's not. It's
Those gold instruments.
Well, exactly. Like, and the prostheses and this and that. To talk about, I'm sure, you've heard all about robots and this and that and the other. But end of the day, the
so you're not going to put a diamond, like a knee replacement in for me?
If I had a diamond
the hardest material.
If I had a diamond knee replacement, would I be here on a Saturday?
Yeah.
Exactly. So everything ends up being similar, and in my experience, the outcome tends to be similar. Some things are a little bit different, but overall, I think in Australia anyway, you're safe both ways.
Yeah.
It's not outrageously bad, either public or private.
You mentioned robotics. You hear so much now about the development of things like AI and robotics in all the different industries, and you do hear about it in medicine and surgery. Is that something that you see is apparent now? Are you actually using it yourself, or is it on the horizon, or is it something that is still quite more far-fetched and just more about headlines and actually building up our hype around it?
Yeah. So again, the truth is somewhere in the middle. In terms of robotics was it's mainly used in knee surgery, so knee replacement surgery, and that's where it's become famous. It is more accurate, it makes things more accurate, but the problem is we don't know what we're being accurate to. For example, knee alignment. It seems to be the biggest topic these days. You must get kinematic, functional, mechanical alignment, etc. But the realms of normal alignment range within a 12-degree set.
Anyway,
Anywhere within that 12 degrees is regarded as normal. The robot will make your cuts accurate to 0.5 degrees as opposed to maybe 1 or 2 degrees. But when your goalpost is 12 degrees, what's half
a degree? Yeah, it's an interesting idea, because I think it is something that the previous surgeons we've had on, some of them are very hell bent on it being, we're getting much better accuracy, we're getting much better outcomes. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case as yet, or at least we don't really understand that fully.
It's better, but it's not a game changer. It's not making people run marathons on knee replacements. So I do think it is evolving, and it's improving. So it is probably the future. But I guess the question here is, how much does a robot cost? Over $1 million. Does spending $1 million on a robot does it overcome the fact that that'll be about 10,000 patients not getting a knee replacement? Is it worth that exchange? Is that $1 million better spent on getting another 1,000 or so patients getting their operation quickly, or are we better spending that $1 million? So I guess that's where the equity comes in. If the robot's for free, we should use it. Why wouldn't you? But the question is it worth the money we spend on the robot, and is it worth the sacrifice to the health budget to spend that money? And that's where it's still a bit of a grey zone.
Is there an area of technology, whether it's robotics or not, that you actually see is something that you're very much looking forward to? That's going to assist you enormously in what you do? And maybe there's a frustration at the moment that it's hard to do this kind of thing?
I think I must admit, the one thing I am most looking forward to is the ability to look at people's x-rays from different companies on a one system. That's the only thing we need in this world.
It's such a pain in the ass, isn't it?
Oh my God, it's like an outrage that, you have to ask them, where do you get your x-rays done? They go, Bell Street. Okay, that does not help. Was it an IMED? Was it Capital? Because I was purple. And it still doesn't help them. And did you have your report? I go, no, I don't have.
And then you find out that the company's changed their colours,
exactly.
So you don't know which one it is anymore.
Yeah, and then you have to apply to see these images, and
it's such a pain in the ass.
Oh, that's it. That's all. We don't need a robot. We just need the ability to look at people's x-rays when we need to look at people's x-rays, and that will make the biggest change in my practice than any other technology out there. So look, apart from that, there's nothing drastically that I think is coming and going. But I do think that give it 100 years, the act of putting metal in people would be gone.
Yeah.
again, it's hard to predict that, but a lot of our problems come from putting metal in people. Like, it's not per se natural.
It's funny, we actually haven't spoken to anyone specifically about that. Can you explain maybe to our listeners some of the effects that you do get from putting, artificial, and foreign objects within people's joints?
So I think the biggest problem is metal is not dynamic. So your body is dynamic. It's constantly remodeling, rehealing, replacing. Metal doesn't do that. So once it's in there, it's always just wearing away to an extent. The other major problem is infection. So your body's immune system can't tackle infection on metal. So should it get infected, and it can get infected at any point in your life, then it's really hard to get rid of that infection from the metal. And that's where a lot of the problems start. Infected metalware is really hard to treat. And with things like
what's the current approach to something like that?
So saying joint replacements is either 3 or 4 washouts if you get it early, or taking out all the metal and putting it all in. And that's where the dichotomy of surgery comes in, because you spend so much time ensuring that metal lasts by making sure it's well fixed, implanted well, and then you get that 1 in 100 that gets infected, and that well implanted metal you have to try and get out, and that destroys a lot of tissue to try and get it out. So I think that's the thing I'm most afraid of, is infection with metalware, and that's why I say in 100 years they'll look back and laugh about how we put metal in people.
Well, I think it's the most approximate solution that we have for the problem that we've got. Obviously, there is technology is changing quite heavily in that space. So I think, as you said, it's hard to predict. Who knows exactly how long it's going to be before that's viable for us to use biologics in some sort of approach to that. But it seems like it will happen. Yeah,
it's always been 5 years away, but I've been saying that for the last
As
20
humans,
years.
it's one thing that we're very bad at doing. We're not actually, the data suggests that we're not bad at predicting things, but we're bad at predicting timelines.
Yeah.
We're really horrible. We always think that it's going to happen sooner than it does.
Yeah, 100% agree.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you is looking at your website, and I found a couple of interesting and amusing things, and one of them
was one my photo.
I thought the photo was fantastic, actually. No, I found it quite amusing. Something that I've noticed about just your personality in general since we've been speaking to organise this is you seem to be a much more laid back and calm than a lot of medical professionals, which I think is actually a really positive attribute. And one of the things I really appreciated was you had your title and in terms of your acronyms for what you've studied. Then you had your star sign. And I was interested, what was the interest in having your star sign there?
Well, I just didn't want to see anyone incompatible. You had to have a Gemini as a patient.
You need to get your astrology reading first.
Well, exactly,
that makes a lot of sense.
Being a Sag, having a Gemini, they don't.
Do you have a clairvoyant in your office then too?
Well, you have to, don't you guys?
How are you going to tell them the outcome otherwise?
Tarot cards. That's why they have.
That's a death card.
Just hide down one. And that's why I don't get many repeat patients.
The death card.
The death card. The coroner loves that one. But to be fair, it's mostly just trying to minimise my business. When people realise that you don't take their health seriously, they're less likely to come to you, which does mean I have more free time. And again, it's all about the minutes. The less busy you are.
What a great luxury.
As I said, it's
like we're laughing about this, but I think Jack is being genuine in the sense of it's a problem that he and I have actually faced quite a bit, because we take what we do very seriously, but we're also not going to give up on enjoying what we're doing and having fun, particularly with each other, because we're close friends as well as business partners. Do you ever get any criticism from your colleagues for being as relaxed as you are about some of these things and making, off-the-cuff comments that, they're clearly jokes, but some people seem to take themselves way too seriously in healthcare, and it doesn't make any sense?
To be honest, not really. Most people would be pretty fine with it. I think.
I imagine actually a lot of people appreciate it, because it's good to actually change that tense atmosphere that can be created from being too serious all the time.
And I must admit, in orthopaedics, people tend to complain when other people are more, I guess, aggressive or more charging more or busier, etc. So it's all about perception of hierarchy of where you are on the ladder. I am dead bottom on the ladder, so no one cares what I do or how I do it. Like, so it's good. So I just kind of slip in under the radar, and everyone's fine with everything I do because I'm not competition to anyone out there. So they're aggressive towards people who are their competitors, but not so much to people they perceive are not competitors. So if you're not aggressively hunting patients or hustling, then they're okay with you. But you find the people who are really successful, really busy, are the ones that are more talked about behind their backs more than anyone else. And we are serious when we have to be serious. So we do a lot of I'm a lot of committees. We do a lot of research and science, etc. So I guess you got to have an even playing field. You can't joke all the time. So I try and keep a balance, and hopefully it works.
You mentioned there, like, doing research and science. I think surgeons are particularly good at getting involved in those processes because they're always, in my mind at least, I feel like surgeons particularly are curious, and they like to innovate, and they like to see, and they like to try new things, to be honest. I think it's a little bit different to maybe other parts of the medical world. And research seems to go hand in hand with that. Do you think that that's something that is good? Do you think it's something that it should be surgeons being the ones kind of putting forward some of these ideas, or do you think it should come from the other direction, that there's a genuine need in the medical world, and then they approach the sort of surgical fraternity to get involved?
Again, it could go both ways. I think innovation relies on being slightly different and questioning the status quo, and whether that comes from the surgeons themselves or the patients or scientists or anyone, as long as you go down the correct pathways, I think both are completely fair. A lot of surgeons are innovators because you're at the coalface, so you do kind of understand what you need and what you want. But
I think the thing, sorry to interrupt you, I think the thing that is really obvious is because you're working in real time and it is a high pressure sort of and a time sensitive environment, you can see very quickly when something is not the right solution for the problem. So you're constantly thinking, like, actually, how do we make this better? Because this is not really working.
By throwing it across the room. That's how I make it better. Whatever's not working.
The instrument's not working, just throw it out the room.
Just throw it.
It's like the TV, when it wasn't working, you just kick it. That always fixes it.
That's the thing. That's where. That's how you get attention.
Throwing stuff.
It's going to make sure you just you throw it away from people.
You just killed all of your staff with a scalpel.
Just throw it in a sterile environment so you can use it again.
Exactly. In this day and age, you can't throw it at people. So I do.
That's one of the disappointing things about the current day and age.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
I think John can get around that. The other thing on your website that I appreciated is you mentioned your interest in reading old medical textbooks.
Yep.
What's the interest in reading some of the older literature?
So two things. One, so as physios, medicos, etc. You learn how to do your task, and half of what you learn is through journals, texts, etc. And say, for example, you guys reading a new journal, new article, that is knowledge. That is, where we are, pinnacle of knowledge at the moment. If you go back 100 years and read the textbooks from the 1800s, 1700s, you get an understanding of what their pinnacle of knowledge was then, and how crazy and stupid it sounds now.
But it's funny, you finish what you're saying, but I actually think that there's something really valuable that comes from doing this.
Well, exactly. And then you realise two things. One, there's two types of knowledge. There's eternal knowledge and changing knowledge. So half the knowledge we're going to gain at the moment through research, etc., is going to be proven completely wrong and ridiculous in 100 years. So you've got to take a grain of salt with everything you think. There is no absolute truth. There's also the eternal knowledge that you find in those books that stayed the same. For example, reading one of those books, they had a whole chapter on who you had to charge up front. And there was literally a whole chapter saying, if they're a carpenter, you got to charge them this much because, if they're a nun, you cannot charge them because God will smite you. And so they had a whole chapter on.
That's great.
Yeah, it's crazy. And that's eternal knowledge. Carpenters are still charging them up front. So they had. So there's knowledge there, and the knowledge that seems to be eternal tends to be more about the consulting side of things and how you talk and approach people, and how the discussions around medicine, etc. And the changing knowledge tends to be the technical aspects of things, like, for example, how they cured a bunion back then. Leeches was the answer.
It doesn't work?
It does not work. And, but then that's what you say. You say, well, maybe the way we're curing bunions now...
Yeah, it will be leeches in 100 years, yeah.
Well, yeah, it will be proven completely wrong in 100 years. So.
It's always it's funny you say that. I'm going to just say a very silly story, but... I saw something with who's the African American astrophysicist, the one that does
Tyson DeGrasse.
Yeah. He's talking to someone about this idea of thinking about intelligence and an intelligent species that is, say, the same deviation of intelligence above us to what we are to, say, chimps, and saying how, do you think that you could teach a chimp how to do algebra? Mm. Saying no, right? Okay, well, imagine that species being the same genetic variation from us in terms of intelligence, and them looking at us being like, why can't you do calculus when you're 1 year old? What's wrong with you? Exactly. You're stupid. Yeah. And it makes me think exactly saying, back then we look at them going, these idiots were using leeches.
What's the thing?
Right? And in 100 years they might be looking at us going, that's how you fix bunions. You guys are idiots.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. So the technical, that's what I got out of it, the books, is, going back to your question, is the technical aspects of things, the way we do things, I don't believe 100%, because I honestly think a lot of what we do today will be proven completely false.
Or seen as barbaric or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And anyone who comes to you and says, this is the only way you can do X, Y, and Z, you just can't believe it, because there is no absolute truth.
Literally, I was going to say, it's something that John and I have spoken about a lot on this podcast. We had a conversation about this yesterday, but the frustration you get where I think about how research is typically dispersed by the researchers, particularly the researcher who did the research, and they talk in such absolutes about their own research as if it is the only
we know this
truth and bit of information related to that particular topic. And it always amazes me too when you talk to some of these people when, for John and I, we try to be more generalists in terms of understanding a bit of everything. And you go, well, have you considered, this aspect related to tendon remodeling? And they look at you like, what are you talking about? And it's amazing how attached people get to this idea of okay, well, it's done and dusted, we know exactly what to do, end of book, and we have the research to support this. So, be wary if you go against us, because we will use our high quality research that cannot be questioned to show that we are correct and we are right.
I'm going to stuff this up, but when we spoke with Antonio, so Jack, I'm not sure if he's mentioned to you in these discussions before this, he's actually doing a 3-year course on the fascial system, and a lot of it's heavily designed by a couple of researchers from the University of Padova in Italy, namely the Stecco family, and it was started by the father, and now the children actually have taken on some of this research, which is kind of cool. And we actually got Antonio, who's the son, on, and we started asking him some questions about the history of it, and he mentioned obviously, where their university is based in Padova has a very long history of anatomy. And we said, what's interesting about this is fascia particularly has been removed from a lot of anatomy books. But you can probably explain, do you remember what he was saying, that there's textbooks from the 1600s? Is that right?
Yeah, so there is certainly textbook. It's actually, I've even got an old Gray's Anatomy textbook that talks a lot more about the deep fascia than a lot of the more relevant anatomy textbooks. And it's that issue of, anatomy is dependent on the anatomist, and it's a good example of the current way that we perceive and conceptualize anatomy, and you would know this better than us with doing
Cutting into people, you'd be dealing with this every day.
I didn't really learn about this, fascial expansion of this muscle to the, aponeurotic fascia, or whatever it may be. And that in itself just highlights, like, for John and I, the thing that's been valuable about learning about the fascial system is going, right.
It's almost a history lesson at times, because you're like, this information was known, but we stopped teaching this.
And the other thing too is, more importantly, that makes a lot more sense clinically when you think about, this referral pattern in this particular plane, or like how do you actually manage sensory motor control, or why is it important to develop strength, flexibility, whatever it is in this particular part of the kinetic chain, and how it affects other areas of the body. But without that knowledge, you don't really have those basic tools or understanding to start problem solving more effectively.
And that's where I think, even interestingly, even though you mentioned, for instance, that the technical aspects have changed, there are some little nuggets at times when you go back and you go, oh, they actually knew a lot about this, and we don't talk about this much anymore. Like, you're aware of it, but you're like, they actually, because maybe the technology allowed them at the time not to move on to something else, they knew a lot about certain things that you're like, oh, that's weird how much they know about this.
Well, the other thing I think too, and like I go back to thinking of the Stecco family, where Luigi, who started it, he was in the first cohort of physios that graduated from in Italy. And back then, this is, let's say, 40, 50 years ago, there was very little research in the field.
I think.
It's kind of it's actually nice in a way to have like a clean start, where it's like you're not bombarded by all these different ideas or beliefs, or thinking like, how do I get through all the research, because it's never ending. None. Well, you can't, like, even now, it's like, how do you? No one can stay on top of the research. It's not like that's actually possible.
Actually, that's a funny. It's like when we had Cobes on.
Yeah.
And one of our colleagues, it was Jack's first boss, actually, a guy named Paul Coburn. I don't know if you know Paul at all. He's on the clinical board for.
Yeah, for TAC. Yeah, but he's also on the radio. He's on the SEN.
Yeah. Does he still do that?
Actually, I'm not sure. He might not now.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Great, older physio, great guy. And he'd be in his 60s now.
Yeah, but he would have graduated maybe like 40 years ago. Yeah.
He was telling us there's this, and I'm going to say it's crappy, physio database for research called Pedro. And he was saying when he first graduated, he was up to date with all of the research that was on that database. Like, he literally was like, I'm going to read this week's
journal
inclusions on this database.
Yeah.
It was hilarious. And he goes, then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, there was, hundreds of thousands of papers. But to start with, he's like, we're up to number 407. And I'm like, I'm reading through them. It was quite funny. He was actually up to date with what was on that database.
Yeah. Well, and I think the interesting thing for him too, he was involved in AFL, used to be physio for Richmond for 10 years or so. And when we used to do PD, he'd always do these sessions where he'd be like, if someone's got like an MCL, we found like it was really good to do friction around this area. And we're like, why? And he goes, honestly, I don't know. We just used to play around with doing this stuff, and we just found it seemed to really help people. So, okay, let's give it a go. But I think it sort of sparks that curiosity of like, well, let's just try that. We'll see how it goes. Where I feel like that is often absent these days in all health professions, because you're so put up to scrutiny by going, well, where's the research for that? And I mean, that's a whole another conversation in itself, but it does spark innovation.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't spark, sorry, it does stifle innovation, I meant to say.
I'll make a couple of quick comments. One, you're right, there's been an exponential growth in publications over the last 10 years. So I think 80% of all the publications have been in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I've heard some stat like this.
Yeah, something crazy. Two, I think in terms of research, how you mentioned kind of that old knowledge and new knowledge, etc. This is being a little bit cynical, is that you find the further you get along in life or in medicine, the more the research is geared towards being more invasive and more expensive because the funding for research tends to come from making, innovations and money, basically.
The things that have commercial viability.
I think of, say, like diet, where, that's a whole dog's breakfast in itself, and there's quite poor research around it because it's expensive, but there's no product involved.
So if there's research that shows, this new prosthesis does a little bit better, then that gets published because it gets funded, and then the people who spoke that get flown all around the world and give tens of talks, and then that becomes, core knowledge. But if you study that, treating this non-operatively or with minor operation does well, no one's making money off that, so no one's flying you around the world saying, present on this.
Tell everyone to do nothing.
Yeah, to do nothing. And so that never gets as much airplay as the other one. And again, it comes down to being confident as well. So the more confident you are in your research, the more likely you are to be listened to because you speak with authority. But in all honesty, the more research you do, again, you more realize that the truth, again, is boring and in the middle, and that never inspires confidence. So you cannot confidently say that this is the only way to do X, Y, and Z. Hence, no one listens to you. Hence, that middle ground, which is often the truth, never gets spruiked, and hence why you get these kind of extremes of knowledge of, you must treat this non-operatively, leave them all alone, or you must use a robot to fix this using X, Y, and Z.
I was just going to say, I feel like that's further perpetuated by the fact that most people like the new shiniest thing. You know, it's like, we've got this new bit of technology, we're going to have a look at your body and it's going to give us this information, or we're going to give you this new drug or whatever it is, and people love that as opposed to...
Patients love that. And then, you put on a bus and then people go, I must have that, and then... and then because the other guys feel like, well, I'm missing out on all that business, I've got to recruit that, and then suddenly it becomes, law. So we looked at a study looking at all the interventions for knee arthritis from mid-1900s to now, and all of them had similar outcomes. Yes, expectations have improved over time, but it all had that kind of 80% improvement type outcome. So our outcomes haven't changed exponentially, even though
the research
our technology and research has. And again, it comes down to, a simile is driving range golf. So the technology in golf clubs has improved exponentially, and balls has improved exponentially, but the actual improvement in max drive has not changed significantly for a long time. So it just comes down to that. We haven't raised the bar that much, even though we spent a hell of a lot more. We've got a lot more technology, and we've got a lot more knowledge. That's the the cynical side of...
All right, here's a question for you then. If that's the case, where do you think innovation is going to come from? Do you have any sort of things in your mind that you start to think, okay, I actually feel like this may be where, it's hard to know because we spoke about prediction before, but like an area where like, I think if something starts developing here, we're going to be onto something here.
So my own beliefs, I think, again, I don't know if this has become true, but I think the microbiome, your biology is going to play a much bigger role in the future. So I think as we're progressing, we're realizing a lot of orthopedic conditions or non-traumatic conditions like arthritis, etc., are partly based on your biome, your bacterial load, your gut bacteria, things like that.
And how that interacts with your immune system and regulates remodeling.
Are you using any of that in your current practice? Or are you just starting to explore it?
Yeah, we're trying to, and we're exploring it. Again, grain of salt with everything I say.
No, but this is, it's nice because for someone like you obviously do come from a position of authority, but it's nice that you're saying, like, we're starting to look at these because we do think that there might be something here. And it doesn't mean that you can adopt it into practice straight away, but it's something that you're, hopeful that is on the horizon.
Yeah, and I'll come back to, I guess, the old textbooks. So go back to the mid-1800s, knee and hip osteoarthritis did not exist. It wasn't a disease that was written down about. If you look at the bones that were dug up, and there's been anthropological studies looking at pre-1900 skeletons. Knee and hip arthritis.
There's a lot less evidence for it,
0.7%, so it's quite low. Then you've got factors like obesity, etc., that have contributed, but they don't account for the level of arthritis we're seeing now. So something else has changed from the early 1900s to now that's said about this epidemic of arthritis, especially in the knee and hip. And you go, well, it's obesity, sedentary, etc. But that doesn't explain why you don't get ankle arthritis. So it's something else going on.
Have you told him your theory about the ankle?
What's the theory about the ankle?
I can't remember what you're talking about.
I'll bring it up. Go, keep going.
It's can't be a good theory if you can't remember it.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember. I think it's a good theory.
Yeah, but then so something else has happened, and part of the thing is, could it be diet related? Could it be something else? And the diet is starting to play a bigger and bigger role. So for more refined carbohydrates, etc., and your gut biome, potentially having an easier time dealing with these new foods and having more time to play around, causing havoc, may play a role in causing things like osteoarthritis. And the other thing that may be, hygiene related. So now that we're, a lot less likely to get infective disorders, your immune system, which is designed to fight battles day to day, no longer has those wars to fight. So it ends up attacking things it shouldn't. And then it comes down to, again, the fact that the synovial joint is one of the only parts of your body that tries to avoid exposure to blood. So it's the only thing that gets food away from blood, so it's the synovial fluid. So it's actively avoiding the immune system. So if you've got something that's affecting the immune system, and if most immune disorders cause arthropathies, then maybe these are all linked. Maybe, hygiene, your gut biome, antibiotics, all of those things are the things that are causing this epidemic of arthritis, as opposed to the age-old thing that's a biomechanical thing causing it.
Yeah, I think that Jack knows more about this than I do, but there's such a large body of evidence growing that it's clear that osteoarthritis particularly is nowhere near as related to the biomechanical load as what we first thought.
Yeah.
Well, think about its correlation too with
metabolic disease.
Metabolic syndrome, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other one, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there seems to be more and more people talking about how the consumption of seed oils has risen exponentially over the last 50 or 60 years, where you're having all these refined, highly processed seed oils from, soybean or sunflower, safflower, and so on, that's causing this real imbalance in our omega-6 to omega-3 content. And if you think about these essential fatty acids, they create the membrane of all of our cells. So you're seeing a structural change in the cells where they typically become much more fragile, much more susceptible to things like oxidation, and again, further accelerating issues like inflammation because of, again, I'm getting a bit too out of my knowledge of it, but because of some of the actual structural change of the cell, making them more susceptible to damage and causing an inflammatory response. That seems to be an interesting one as well, that sort of fits in with the timeline of what has changed in our environment.
Yeah, 100%. So the environment, again, diet and things like that probably play a much larger role in all these lifestyle disorders than we once thought.
Do you want me to tell Sina your theory?
Oh, please do, because it must be so good that I've forgotten it. I can't remember what you're talking about.
Well, I remember Jack does our in-house PD, and I remember he presented a paper looking at osteoarthritis and particularly the effect of adiposity, and particularly the release of...
Yeah, I know what you're talking about now.
Yeah, like cytokines like adipokines and things like that, and the effect that it has systemically, and the relation that probably has to the joint, and particularly joints that are in close proximity. So one of the discussions we had was, hip and knee, as you said, has increased over time, but ankle not so much. And I remember we had the discussion, we said, well, maybe that's because actually you don't tend to develop adiposity around your ankle in any way, shape or form like you do around your knee or hip. And that could be part of why you end up developing the osteoarthritic changes, because the actual proximity of the fat mass is not in the same spot. Yeah. Now, that's completely us just spitballing ideas, but it would probably make some sense if that was true, because it also probably explains why we don't get necessarily the same development of arthritis in other areas of our body as well.
And then highlighting that factor of fat mass is metabolically active, it secretes these adipokines that are typically pro-inflammatory in nature, and therefore is going to have an effect systemically, but probably more in more close proximity.
Yeah, don't know if it's true. We just
but it's those like left field. You're talking about where does innovation come from? It's these left field ideas that that may be the start of something big. That'll be a game changer as opposed to I
got really interested in the microbiome stuff, with like looking at the area of, it's called like psychobiotics. Have you seen any of that? It's like it's basically how your microbiome produces a lot of neurotransmitters based on what you eat and what the constituent of your diet is, and then therefore the bacterial colonization structure or profile of your gut. Because we all have similar, but some people have a greater proportion of this type of bacteria in this one. It's usually got to do with what they've eaten in the past and what they currently eat and all those kind of things. And they did all these rodent models, and basically they were trying to work out why they could feed certain foods and even like prebiotics to rodents and induce what they called mouse or rat depression.
Yeah.
But they're like, we know that there's not crossing of these neurotransmitters into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. So like,
vagus nerve.
Basically, they found it through the vagus nerve, and what they found hasn't always been replicated, but they did find in a number of studies where they actually cut the vagus nerve to the stomach, and all of a sudden, rat depression, gone.
Yeah. I know, and again, way out of my field.
Oh, it's out of all of this.
And very limited knowledge, but there are some models. There must be some type of animal model of looking at the relationship between lectins, a certain essentially anti-nutrient found in plants, related to...
We like telling people not to eat plants.
Neurodegenerative disease, and specifically Parkinson's.
Yeah.
And again, it travelled through the nerve, which seems to be like, wait, hang on, things don't travel through the nerve, do they? But there seemed to be some connection to it. I don't, again...
You haven't heard these theories?
I'm not elected. I've heard the rat one. I haven't heard the
No. I mean, there's... Jack can explain it better than I, but there's a number of people that actually put forward this concept in nutrition that eating plants, a number of them are not as anywhere near as good for you as what you think because they have these plant defense mechanisms built in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think also too, it's probably more to the fact that it seems that humans have the capacity to have a very diverse diet, but because of changes in the microbiome, whether we're having issues with being able to metabolize and process certain compounds that create an autoimmune response, and hence the connection between a lot of autoimmune problems that are going up exponentially in society too.
Again, this is completely out of our area, but it's an interesting area to tackle.
Yeah, but there's something to it. You're right. There's something to it that we just haven't quite figured out.
There's a theory, and like you've discussed this, but there's a theory of, say, eating vegetables and fruit, particularly vegetables, that it's the benefit that you get from it is actually based on the hormetic response that you get because your body has to actually fight off those defense mechanisms.
Because it's like a pro-oxidant. There's all these compounds that upregulate your defense system.
Initially, it's not good for you, but your body actually adapts over time, and it actually makes you more healthy because it's...
I think that's a pretty well-established thing.
I know, but it seems counterintuitive. People go, oh no, vegetables are healthy. Well, actually, initially they're not that healthy. It's just your body learns to adapt to it.
And then that's the thing with fibre as well. Like fibre, you don't actually digest most of it. So then most of that's feeding your colon bacteria. Yeah. So it's all these little things that we just don't understand. And here we are thinking, we'll decrease the alignment by 2 degrees, and that's going to make all the difference. Yeah. So it's
But that's actually something else that John and I have spoken about a few times in the podcast with each other, but with other guests. But thinking about dietary changes, particularly related to joint-related issues, with the reduction in how much collagen we consume, because once upon a time we'd kill the animal, we'd eat the whole animal. We'd eat the lean meat, we'd eat the tough bits of meat, we'd eat the joints, we'd eat the organs.
That's one of the things, actually, interestingly, that I very much appreciated being in Europe and older cultures.
Yeah.
That those eating everything is actually still very common.
Yep.
Whereas...
You go to the supermarket and they have all the different...
bats,
organs, bats.
We saw how that ended.
Literally,
why not deep fried bat?
Exactly.
The best meal,
chicken of the cave.
The best meal that I had when I was away was tripe, by far.
Yeah, I actually haven't tried tripe.
And actually, the best one was. I don't know if I told you this. Are you going to Florence at all this time?
No, I'll just be in Panama, basically.
If you ever go to Florence, any of our listeners, don't ask what it is, but go actually right outside the San Ambrogio market, right, in Florence. It's like the people's market. Don't go to the main market. Go to the people's market at San Ambrogio.
They sell actual people?
It's for the people. There's a van of a guy, and I think it's his cousin. They run this food van, right, and they sell something called lambradotto.
Yeah.
Right? Don't ask what it is. You can get it either in a bowl or you can get it in a bread roll. And I say just get it in a bread roll. It's delicious.
Get it quickly while it's still meat.
Well, I won't tell you what it is, but it's by far one of the most fun things that I sat there eating these bread rolls and drinking beers in the hot Florence sun.
Yeah, well, it's something that I think of some of the research that's coming out of Keith Barr's lab of looking at collagen supplementation for tendon remodeling, and there seems to be
some association.
Some association that one of the limiting factors for tendon remodeling is, do you actually have the appropriate building blocks? And just applying a very simple principle of, well, is it similar for joint tissue? Do we need to actually consume more type 2 collagen so we actually have that building block?
We've spoken about this a lot with other people because obviously type 2 collagen, it's almost impossible to get even in your diet. You have to eat very specific things.
Yeah. And again, it all comes down to the diet being important. And the other factor with all this is, talking about the biome, etc., is our antibiotic use. We've gone from pre-900, no antibiotic use, to 900, and suddenly you've got all these disorders. Maybe, us giving, 2 grams of cortisone every time we operate is changing people's...
Oh, it definitely would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and people go and get a box of antibiotics for the minorest cold, and whether that's slowly changing everything inside you.
It would have to.
Yeah.
Did you have any other things that we are
we're really just getting started, aren't we?
It's a 4-hour podcast.
We'll be here all night. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, look, one question we always ask our guests is, and this is actually be a good question for you because it sounds like you're someone who likes to do lots of different things, but is there anything that you're learning at the moment, and let's keep it not related to your profession, that you're finding particularly interesting or sparking your curiosity?
We talked through most of it actually. It was all about the microbiome, and that's being the main.
Yeah, well, that's a good topic.
Yeah, that was the main focus of my reading for the last.
Well, actually, if you want to elaborate on that, like, where are you looking for some of this? Are you going through medical journals? Are you looking a little bit more into like more popular texts and books? Like what
combination? So I think.
Have you got any tips for people who are interested in this stuff where they can look for some of this information?
Well, the greatest place to start, and this is where I started, is there's a book called We Are Multitude, or I Am Multitude, by Eric Young, I think his name was. And that was a great starter in talking about that topic per se. And that sparked that intensity, and it just makes you think. And then we go into the actual literature, so the proper evidence-based literature, and there is definitely a lot of evidence coming through about all of this stuff in the last 5 or so years. And then combining that with, I went back and looked at all those books from the 1800s, and that's when you realise that none of these diseases existed back then. Yes, people died quicker.
When you bring, say that, do you bring this up with colleagues and you say, like, okay, well, osteoarthritis was not a thing. So, like, do you ask them, what's your thought on that?
Well, the two biggest questions, and I ask all the registrars this, is what causes osteoarthritis and why is it painful? And you'd be surprised how few people know the answers to either. So we treat all these disorders day in and day out, and you look at the literature, and we've spent, 3/4 of the literature is all about treating knee arthritis, mostly through surgery, knee replacement. There's about 200 papers in the last 2 weeks about alignment, but trying to get to the bottom of
what actually it is and why does it hurt?
Why does it hurt? And you can't get a straight answer of anyone. Like a very small proportion of the literature is dedicated to why is arthritis painful? Why can 2 people have the same looking x-rays but some of them are in pain, some of them are not? And what's caused it to begin with?
In your mind, what is that? What is the current literature clear on?
Or is it still up in the air? It's very much unclear. And it has, I think, a lot to do with the inflammatory response and all. It seems to be a chronic inflammatory condition that's partly attributed to diet throughout your life and your biome, I think. But it is unclear. And the whole idea of why it's painful is again unclear. Why do some people get so much pain early and then it kind of burns out? And that's all.
And particularly that lack of correlation between the structural integrity on a investigation and someone's symptoms. But I know actually there's an article that was published quite recently, I think the author was Klein, of looking at chronic pain conditions, chronic low back pain, neck pain, like repetitive overuse problems, and looking at systemic inflammatory markers and seeing that there is a real strong correlation between these people with certain chronic pain conditions and changes in systemic or low-grade chronic inflammation. So again, it really highlights that, and I often think about this with a lot of patients we see, and this can even be relatively young and somewhat healthy patients, of what environmental factors are predisposing you to either getting an acute type of orthopaedic sports-related injury, and then also in particular when people get more like that non-specific insidious onset, where it's like, well, you know, is this purely a mechanical musculoskeletal related factor, or do we actually need to have a look at other environmental or non-physical factors for you?
Yeah, and then the third part of that kind of pie is your brain. Like, you know, what effect does psychology have on all of these?
Sure.
Yeah,
and that's
massive.
another aspect of it that hasn't actually been explored very well. Like,
Yeah.
it's all connected. Your brain-gut joint axis is real. How does one affect the other, affects the third, is really not clear. I think, you know, we were talking about innovation before. That may be what the next, 50 years is all about.
Just putting those pieces together.
Yeah, and working it out, because there's definitely a lot more to it than we think. And that's why I kind of feel the further we get along, the less likely we are to put metal in people, and the more likely we are to treat things.
We're seeing this more and more of, and we had this discussion the other day as well, but we're seeing more and more that these areas seem to be connected. Yet the world of healthcare and medicine is all about people specializing down to the most specific thing they almost can. And there are really clear reasons why that is useful at times. You know, you can become very, very technically proficient in that area.
Surgery is probably a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, however, that does and has led us down the garden path a little bit to maybe why we haven't got better answers for things like osteoarthritis? Because someone's looking at knee osteoarthritis as if it's some completely separate problem to hip or shoulder or, hand arthritis or something like that. Do you think that that's a potential thing that we've over-specialised to the point where we're missing the forest for the trees?
Definitely. And where that comes into play, I think, is life's a pendulum. If you go back, again, a couple of 100 years, you used to have doctors, and then you used to have the barbers. The barbers were the technicians who used to operate. The doctors were, the thinkers who used to say, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Go to the barber and do that. At some point, that's amalgamated to, that being the same person. And hence, if you have a hammer, you're going to find ways to use that hammer. Use your tools. So you become very much invested in what you can and can't do. And then you pigeonhole people. So you're in osteoarthritis, I can do this for you. You're not, I can't help you. Go away. And that's, I think, part of the reason why patients become frustrated with surgeons and doctors in the 21st century, and why there's an ever-expanding market outside of medicine that's developed around medicine, is because doctors no longer have the impetus to deal with people they can't treat specifically in their field that they can pigeonhole. And I feel at some stage the pendulum will probably swing the other way, is when the technicians stay technicians, but then you have doctors or people more generalists who become more generalized and become more the thinkers and do less of the technical stuff. And that may help with that side of things, and then it'll swing back the other way. And then so it's all a swinging paradigm of being too specialized and not being specialized enough. And we're forever going from one to the other. I'm sure there's a happy median, but
One question I wanted to follow up with regards to the microbiome. As you are looking into it more, how do you think that looks in terms of being implemented clinically? Like, are there people now that are doing microbiome analysis and perhaps prescribing certain probiotics or foods? Like, how do you think that actually looks clinically when we understand it and start implementing it?
Well, I think, the hard bit is trying to figure out how they're all connected. And then once you know how they're connected, then you can start treating it or preventing it. Unfortunately, again, the more research you do, the more you realize that once set, it's quite hard to change your biome. So there's been a lot of work on prebiotics, probiotics, etc. And none of it's been super successful, because once it's all kind of set, when you're a kid, then it's really hard to reverse or change that in the future. So it may come down to prevention down the track. So, for example, there's all this research on, natural birth versus cesareans, all those early days of hygiene, too much hygiene, not enough, antibiotics, vaccines, etc.
Get your hands out in the dirt.
Yeah, so all those little things. And, for example, it's all anecdotal, but that kind of the post-COVID world where everyone was extra cautious with their hands. Everyone seemed to get sick all of a sudden a year or two after. So it's all connected. But to be fair, I don't know how we're going to treat it. I think we're still in the implementation phase of trying to figure out how they're connected. And then once we know, it may be more in terms of prevention than anything else. But again, I found with society that people just want more quick fixes. I don't know if we'll be able to prevent it or anything, because people won't,
Don't want to implement something that takes a long time.
Yeah, no one wants to not have their fries. So, again, I think we all know we should be eating healthier, have correct weight, etc., but we don't. So even if we have all the knowledge in the world, it may not prevent anything. So, we'll have to see.
Well, and that's an interesting conundrum, because I think people are always looking for the technological solution. Yeah. And even though there is an exponential increase in research, you're seeing also an increase in chronic disease.
Yeah.
So, that's something I often think about too, of does it require some type of fundamental change to how the healthcare system works to incentivize people to take responsibility for their health and well-being, because it seems that most people aren't willing to take on that.
Exactly. And so have a fat tax. That's all we need.
On that, I think we've ended it perfectly.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Sina. We really appreciate you being willing to come in and share your knowledge and spark some interesting questions for us to actually go and explore as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Hope you haven't been disappointed.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.